This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we'll be joined by Graeme MacQueen. We'll be talking a little bit about his paper from 2006, which looks into the accounts of explosions at the World Trade Center by people who were there on the scene. And we'll also be talking about the Anthrax attacks, which I consider to be a continuation of the 9/11 crime. He wrote a book about it. We'll be going into some of the facts related to that matter as well. So all that is coming your way in just a moment. Stay tuned.
He was in the lobby and then the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
We have explosive demolition at not only the Twin Towers, but also Building 7.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
You want to call your mother or something?
It's just a matter of time. That's all it is. It's a matter of time and the persistence of those who continue to adhere to it and push for it. And that's what we're doing.
Tune in to 9/11 Freefall, a show about 9/11 truth, 9/11 science, and the activists and scholars who are blowing the lid off the crime of the century. You can download episodes at 911freefall.com.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Graeme MacQueen is the founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where he taught for 30 years. He's also a 9/11 scholar, having published many works on the truth of what happened on that day, digging into volumes and presenting what a lot of the corporate media and government has overlooked, hence why this movement exists. We're going to be talking about some of that today, and we're going to be diving a little bit into the Anthrax attacks, which is something that's overlooked a lot, even in 9/11 Truth. I'm not saying there aren't people in the 9/11 Truth movement who talk about it, but you don't hear a lot about it. And to me, it's all considered part of the same thing. I can remember walking into a professor's office over another matter having to do with a class, and the look of terror on his face as he was reading news accounts of the Anthrax attacks, and it was like we were being shocked and awed all week. So that's why it's important to cover this as well. But Graeme, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you, Andy. It's good to be here.
So I want to talk first about what I consider to be your most widely known work. And this is when you put the accounts from first responders, people on the ground, of explosions together in one volume. You went through the oral histories and did that service for the world. Please remind our audience about that, because there may be new listeners who are not aware of this work. Actually, somebody asked me where we had gotten all of these accounts from last week, a newcomer to the movement, and I pointed them right to your work. So please, what prompted you to go about doing that work?
Yes, okay, I'd be happy to talk about that. Well, I was a bit slow in the uptake with 9/11. I opened a file on it somewhere around 2003 and was never completely convinced of the Al-Qaeda hypothesis, but I mainly went along with the flow, which of course I think is inexcusable in retrospect. Anyway, Around 2005, I had started to get serious about looking into this for various reasons we won't go into. And one of the articles that impressed me was by David Ray Griffin. It was, I think, late in 2005, Explosive Evidence. And he had access, if not directly, then indirectly, to the recently released World Trade Center Task Force reports, which are, I don't know, I never counted, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 pages, I guess, of interviews with approximately 500 members of the Fire Department of New York. Generally, the interviews were carried out by members of the FDNY. A superior officer typically would interview someone else. Could be firefighter, could be EMTD, emergency, medical technician. Could be doctors, could be various other people, but mostly firefighters. So that material was available, and several people went through it and assisted David Ray Griffin to tell the world that there were accounts in there of explosions in the towers when they went down. Now, we'd known a little bit about that before, but we hadn't had this many really impressive accounts. So I read his article and I thought, my gosh, this is important material, and it's just been released to the public. I'm a retired prof, I'm a text scholar. I can just push aside all the other work that I had lined up to do, clear my desk, get a hold of these 12,000 pages and go through the whole thing carefully, asking a number of specific questions. For example, it was clear that David hadn't picked them all. He was just trying to give us examples. So I wanted to get a comprehensive list of explosion witnesses. I also wanted to see if there were a lot of witnesses who said something different and who clearly saw something that would support the structural failure hypothesis. In other words, I was keeping an open mind. And the good thing is that this was early enough in my 9/11 truth career that I really I genuinely had an open mind. That is, if you asked me now, I would say, well, I'm completely convinced this was a fraud, and it's very difficult to keep an open mind, although I try. Back then it was easy, because I didn't know for sure what had happened. So I said, this is my chance to read the accounts of 500 people who were there on that day, right in the thick of things, getting bashed around and wounded and inhaling all this crap, and listen to what they actually said for themselves, and to see whether there's anything to this business about the towers being brought down with explosive force instead of through structural failure. So that's what I did. I cleared my desk, and I don't remember how many months it took, but I didn't do much else but eat and drink and sleep and read that stuff. So then when I got finished, I had sort of carpal tunnel and bleary eyes and everything else. I realized that rather than just posting it on the internet, I should see if I could get it included in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which wasn't all that old at that point. And I didn't really know anybody connected to the journal at that point. I was just nobody who decided to do this piece of work. So I submitted it, and they were quite efficient. They got back to me. They got it reviewed. I saw the reviews. There were things they wanted me to change, which is good. I mean, that's how a peer-reviewed journal should behave. And that involved a fair bit more work. I had to go back and read a couple of thousand pages of the NIST reports that I hadn't read properly before. And it strengthened the article, and then they carried it. And you can find it online. It's called 118, 118 Witnesses, I guess. And then there's a subtitle, something like Firefighters' Accounts of Explosions in the Twin Towers. I'm sorry, I don't even remember the title, but it's something like that. And, if you Google my name and then 118 Witnesses, you'll get it. And I decided that in addition to summing up the importance of the evidence, I would include in my appendix all 118 names and, in fact, all 118 accounts so that people could read them for themselves and make sure that I wasn't making this up. And I also included in another appendix accounts of, I guess what I call the non-explosion hypothesis, witnesses whose accounts seemed to support a different theory, the structural failure hypothesis. And one of the interesting things is that the structural failure eyewitnesses among the FDNY people were very slim, very few and far between. So that was a pretty small list. But the other list was, as I say, 118, which is a lot of witnesses. And of course, there were more witnesses. We've gotten more since then. But that was just using this one pile of material, the World Trade Center Task Force reports, when the FDNY members were interviewed. And there are a lot of good things about that as a source. For one thing, those interviews were done not long after 9/11. In other words, if you had a trial today and you brought those firefighters to the stand, that would be really important, and I strongly support doing it. But, a person can always say, well, look how many years have gone by, their memory is distorted, blah, blah, blah. But the World Trade Center Task Force interviews were done quite quickly, somewhere between anywhere between 1 and 4 months after the event. And I give a range because different people were interviewed at different times. It went on for some time. But the memories were pretty fresh. The trauma was fresh. Some of these folks couldn't even complete their interviews. They were so moved or so traumatized. And in a court, I believe in a U.S. court, though I have slightly different rules in Canada where I come from, that you could make a strong case for all that stuff being included, even if you didn't have the eyewitness, even if they had died, for example, because this was stuff that was given by them as part of their duties as firefighters. They were asked to contribute to this, and it was an FDNY initiative. And that's one of the categories of evidence that's generally allowed into a courtroom if you don't have the actual eyewitness. If this was something done in the course of duty of, an official person, then, it can count. So for all kinds of reasons, this was important stuff. And yeah, that number, 118 witnesses, 118 became a well-known figure after that, and I've bumped into a number of people who don't know where it came from. But that's where it came from.
Right, and just for the audience, in case they want to Google this, the full title is 118 Witnesses, the Firefighters Testimony, 2 Explosions in the Twin Towers, dated August 21st, 2006. And I recommend that everybody download this and keep this to their library. I actually want to, at some point, I'll have to get a new place, but I want to print out every single important topical paper related to 9/11 truth and actually create a physical library of them, which will be good for me. I don't know if the rest of the movement will have access to it, but I'm recommending the movement do this and at least have this on their hard drive to reference later on. And you mentioned the 118 number being well known. And there's a reason you came to 118, because you had a very strict guideline that you followed when you looked through these accounts and looked for these eyewitness testimonies of explosions. Because you didn't just use people who might have said, oh, I heard a boom, because a boom could mean a lot of things. You were very strict. Can you just briefly tell our audience about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, there had already been some discussion before I did that research about what eyewitnesses heard and saw, and the people who were dismissing it as irrelevant often said, oh, it could have been, girders snapping, it could have been elevators falling, it could have been bodies hitting the ground, it could have been anything. So what? There were loud sounds. Of course there were loud sounds, blah, 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 blah. So I faced that challenge. How can I sort out the difference between those kinds of sounds and what I was talking about? And there's a wider problem here, and that is, how do you do what is really qualitative research? You're reading eyewitness accounts, you're not doing physics, you're not doing math. How can you do qualitative research and yet come out of it with some pretty hard figures, some quantitative stuff? And I'd had experience doing that in the past as an academic. So what I decided here was first of all, read all the accounts and take notes. And that took a while. And then you are able to sort out, in retrospect, what are the key categories, the key actual terms that people will have to use in order for this to be classified as an explosion witness and an explosion account. So I came up with quite a small list of terms. Explosion, for example, and the related verbal forms like it exploded, but also blast. I don't even remember because I don't have the article in front of me, but there's a small list of 5 or 6 terms, and if you didn't use that, then it didn't get counted, even if it sounded to me like somebody was actually hearing an explosion. They had to, as an eyewitness, they had to identify it as an explosion, in effect, by themselves. It's not good enough for me as an interpreter to identify it as an explosion. They had to identify it as an explosion. And that's why I got a list of 118. If I had looked very broadly and included everything that I thought might have been an explosion, it would have been a bigger list. But and 118, by the way, doesn't refer to the number of references to explosions. It refers to the number of witnesses. Some of these witnesses use the term explosion or blast more than once, so there's actually even more references, but it's 118 individual people who refer to explosions, and these have to be around the time of the actual collapse. And that means, of course, that I'm excluding a whole bunch of other interesting references to explosions, such as those that Willie Rodriguez and others mention very early, either around the time of the airplane strikes or before the airplane strikes. I didn't go into that, and that's partly because there weren't any firefighters on the scene at that point. I wanted to restrict myself to that particular time when the buildings were being destroyed. I don't like the word collapse very much, so let's say when the buildings were being destroyed, there were all these explosions going on, and as you know, Andy, neither the FEMA report nor the NIST report makes anything at all of these explosions. NIST has one brief sentence, I think, in its entire report in which it dismisses this. The 9/11 Commission so dismisses it briefly. Each one of them, I think, has a couple of lines. And yet they had access to this material. So it's gross negligence or outright fraud, take your pick. But in any case, this is something, if there were ever a trial, that would be very important. And even if there isn't a trial, as people who want to know, as citizens who are investigating this is eyewitness evidence is one of the very important kinds of evidence. And I know I'm going on at some length, so let me conclude with one more statement. Some people say, well, it's not hard evidence. It depends on what you mean by hard. It's not the same as free fall acceleration. It's not the same as nanothermite in the dust. Quite right. But it's not soft, if by that you mean easy to dismiss. In fact, I usually say it's neither hard nor soft, it's tough. It's tough evidence, and getting rid of it is like trying to get rid of some tough weeds in your garden. It persists, it resists, because it's there and it's real and there's a ton of it.
Yeah, and you said about NIST, whether or not this is gross negligence or outright fraud. I guess the polite professional way to go about it is to point to the first, and the truthful way is to point to the latter. We've seen so many accounts of NIST just outright ignoring evidence. It's clear what they were assigned to do, come up with a predetermined conclusion, and then somehow make the science fit into that box as best as they can, even if they have to be unscientific. In the early years of this show, I used this analogy of a guy buying a teddy bear at some tourist spot for his girlfriend while on a trip, but he can't fit it into the suitcase, so he just starts hacking off limbs from it and its ears and stuff, and by the time he brings it home to her, it's just this monster. It's just all the stuffing is out and it's no longer the teddy bear. That's what we got here with the NIST report and the 9/11 Commission report, which was really just a rubber stamp because some widows from 9/11 who were made widows by the 9/11 attacks raised a heroic stir over it, and that's why we even got the commission in the first place.
I like the reference to the NIST teddy bear. That's good.
Exactly. So we know what the score is. We know what NIST was about. We know what 9/11 was about and that we were lied to. This is just further evidence of it. And it's not just in the oral histories. I mean, there is a video out there of firefighters standing around a payphone where you can very clearly hear an explosion. And HBO, when they made a documentary on their channel about 9/11, shortly after the attacks, when I say shortly, within a few years, and they deliberately cut the part out where the explosion happens and went to the next clip. There was a deliberate decision to take that part out. So, work that you've done is a service to the truth movement. It continues on. It's something that I can continue to point to when people ask me, well, how do I know this? Well, here you go. This guy did the work to get it down on paper. And that's what I wanted to remind everybody, because I still have people ask me where these sources came from. And I consider it part of my job to sort of be the librarian here on this show for newcomers who weren't educated about 9/11 truth in schools for obvious reasons, to come and do this research and remind everybody. Now, what I've been doing on the show beginning last week, is we're still 9/11 focused, and we're still focusing on the controlled demolition overall in the show, but I'm looking at other things a little bit surrounding 9/11 that I consider related. And of those things that I'm looking at, I would say the anthrax attacks is the most closely related, even though the corporate media has sort of treated it like it's a separate incident. Now, they didn't treat it like it was a separate incident the week of the attacks. It was treated like this is a continuation of 9/11. Like we were just going to get something new every single day for an undetermined period of time. But then when they found out that it wasn't some Arab guy in a country that happens to be located over our oil, they kind of dismissed it. But there's more to the story than that. And so I want you to tell the story. I actually have the book in front of me, and the title of it is The 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. I have the PDF of it right here, and we're going to talk about how people can get this book later on in the program. But, Graeme, just summarizing the events regarding anthrax for people who didn't live through this and may not know about it, can you just give a brief overview first of the official story, what we were told, and then we'll begin to dissect it?
Okay, well, people didn't actually know there was an anthrax attack going on the week of 9/11. It wasn't discovered till later. But the attacks themselves began a week after 9/11. As far as we know, around September 18th is when the first letter was sent out. So what were the anthrax attacks? They were attacks in which spores of anthrax, which is a deadly parasitic bacterium, spores were put into envelopes together with a little brief letter, a note, and were sent around in the mail in the United States, initially to news agencies, and then a second wave to 2 Democratic senators. And these attacks took place between September 18th and November, or at least the last death occurred in November. 5 people died of inhalation anthrax, which is extremely deadly, and another group were injured, some of them very seriously, because this stuff can destroy your organs, and you won't necessarily heal afterwards. Altogether, at least 22 people were infected. That's the usual figure that's given. About half of them with cutaneous anthrax, meaning in your skin, forms a black blister, and the other half with inhalation anthrax, which is much deadlier, and that's when you actually breathe in the anthrax spores and they lodge in your lungs and begin to take off and flourish. So that's what happened. There were at least 22, some people think it was twice as many, people who got infected. 5 died, 2 of them were postal workers because the stuff was going through the mail. The anthrax spores were treated in a sophisticated way, especially the second wave to the senators, was more refined and I'm going to use the term weaponized, more weaponized than some scientists had ever seen in their lives. Very, very sophisticated stuff. And so why did people think it was connected to 9/11? Well, first of all, it comes right on the heels of 9/11. Secondly, the letters, two particular letters, have the date 9/11 at the top. So they're obviously trying to make a connection with 9/11, even though they weren't actually mailed on 9/11, but they put the date at the top. And they're printed in crude and sometimes unidiomatic or even wrong English. And they've got, Allah is great or something at the end. In the meantime, they say things like, take penicillin now, we have this anthrax, death to America, death to Israel. Another good phrase that I like, and one of them is, are you afraid? So these are, and, penicillin is spelled wrong, and the whole thing is very crude. So we get the impression that these are semi-literate or illiterate in English, Arab guys, Muslim guys who are talking about Allah, who have a beef against the United States and Israel. And they're quite obviously, with the date 9/11, saying, hey, here we are again, we're following up our airplane attack with this attack. And we're the same people. And so that's what the majority of people came to conclude at that time. We know that from surveys. And it was a natural conclusion initially for people to come to. So that's the official story now. Now the official story initially emphasized how serious and deadly and dangerous these attacks were, and how much anxiety and panic they were supposedly causing in the United States. And here's why. I mean, first of all, there's a limited amount of damage you can do with airplanes, but what we're talking about here is a weapon of mass destruction. That's what a biological weapon is, the famous WMD. And here we have a case where WMD were used against the elected representatives of the American people. WMD were used against Congress. Think about it. How many people even know that? So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that was emphasized, of course, at the time, and it was very scary because potentially you could not only have a devastating attack against Congress, but you could have huge numbers of people killed. I won't go through the various scenarios, but there are all kinds of ways you could use aerosolized anthrax to kill very large numbers of people. So this was no joke, and this was not taken as a joke. And the only reason, as you say, that this has gone down the memory hole is because it didn't turn out well. This story, unlike the 9/11 story, fell apart quite quickly. It proved to be a false story. It proved that it didn't have to do with the two alleged perpetrators, namely Al-Qaeda and Iraq. They were both being framed for this. It turned out that it came from a weapon in the U.S. that served the military-industrial complex. So, of course, yikes, that's not a very nice narrative. The FBI didn't like that narrative very much, so they went hunting for a lone nut that they could blame it on, and the rest, as they say, is history. So many people today don't even remember the attacks, or they remember them vaguely and say, oh, yeah, I think I remember something about that. Didn't they find the guy? And, and so it's considered insignificant, whereas here's how I approach it. First of all, why did I write that book? I didn't set out initially to be an expert in the anthrax attacks. I was already a 9/11 researcher. I had written my stuff on eyewitness reports, and with Tony Zambodi, I had written The Missing Jolt, and I had written this thing about the seismic evidence, and I had written something about foreknowledge of Building 7, and so I saw myself as doing 9/11 research. But at one point I asked myself, a little bit like you said, you and your show, are there things happening around 9/11 that we need to know about and that are clearly related to 9/11, and that might even be an inroad, a way of getting into the issue of 9/11, a way of showing people what we're talking about? And I said, well, there's these anthrax attacks, which I keep hearing about, which I haven't looked into. I keep hearing about the fact that this anthrax was traced to a U.S. military lab. Well, if that's true, that's really important. I need to see if that's true. So I set out with limited aims, and I found that, yes, indeed, it had been a fraudulent attack and had been traced to a U.S. domestic lab. But I found out more than that. I found out, to my surprise, that there were strong connections to the 9/11 operation. And so I began to see that as a 9/11 researcher, I had to do this anthrax work. I had to write this book, and I had to show people that this is not just about the anthrax attacks. This is a way of approaching the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, and what I remember about this, because you mentioned about how the envelopes had this really crazy handwriting on it, and there was messages about death to America, and you get this impression as a regular spectator in America that there's some kind of Muslim Frankenstein monster who can barely articulate himself, somehow got his hands on this stuff and is sending these things out. But then after all this stuff is happening in the country and you're trying to live your daily life and follow it as best you can, you suddenly get the message that it's actually a white guy who was working for the U.S. government. Can you talk about Bruce Ivins and how he ended up getting fingered as the person that was responsible for these attacks and the circumstances surrounding that?
I'm happy to talk about Bruce Ivins, but let me just say something else first. In a very broad and general way, I want to say something before I forget about how the anthrax attacks can be useful for us in discussing 9/11. We can say that 1 week after 9/11, a series of attacks took place, and these were deadly. And it is now acknowledged by virtually everyone, including Homeland Security and the FBI, that the second wave of attacks were an inside job and a false flag operation. Now, the FBI doesn't use those terms, but you and I do. They were an inside job in that they came from inside the U.S. military-industrial complex. And by the way, they didn't come from Bruce Ivins. And secondly, they were a false flag attack because these letters tried to frame Muslims for it. And that's what a false flag attack is. X does something and blames Y. So we have two lethal attacks in September and following of that year. And the second group, the second set of attacks, is an inside job and a false flag operation trying to frame Muslims, evidently in order to make it easier to invade their countries and for other reasons as well. Now, if a person realizes that and says, it isn't even controversial what I said about the anthrax attacks, and the FBI admits it, then wouldn't that make you ask some questions about 9/11 attacks too? Wouldn't that make you say, well, gee, if the second set of attacks was an inside job and a false flag operation meant to frame Muslims so we could invade their countries, isn't it possible that the 9/11 attacks were the same? And that's how I use it when I give talks, and I think that's a very important approach.
Absolutely. I suspect that is why it was memory hold, because actually that was a huge piece of good psyoping, if you really think about it, just from what I remember. I can remember when this was happening, my imagination was running wild. I said, oh my God, what if they put it on the money? I could envision grocery store clerks with masks and gloves handling money. And even if they didn't put it on every single bill in the United States, or even 0.01% of them, just the panic it would cause to do something like that, or the panic that it caused. I still actually have a card from the U.S. Postal Service telling the public about how they're going to be extra safe with the mail. It's in a box somewhere from my newspaper headlines. But it put a lot of fear in the general public, even if you only got these people. And I'm not minimizing the lives lost from the attacks, but 5 people out of 300 million, if there's a car accident or something, you don't think that that's necessarily going to happen to you, even though you got a higher chance of it happening to you statistically than being killed by an anthrax attack. People were in a panic as a result of this. So I do see this as 9/11's lesser-known sequel that just continued the story a week later, and it's very important to look at. So I wanted to talk about Bruce Ivins because people don't think that he actually did this for good reason.
On the one hand, I'm happy to talk about Bruce Ivins, but on the other hand, there's some more important stuff that I want to make sure I get a chance to talk to during this hour. In fact, in some ways, Bruce Ivins is a distraction. This is a limited hangout position. I mean, the FBI, when the official anthrax story collapsed, which it did, it helped get the Patriot Act through. It was very important in the passage of the Patriot Act. And as soon as the Patriot Act was signed into law by George Bush, the anthrax attack story fell apart. Somehow or other, some genuine scientists managed to get in there and have a look at this anthrax and study it, and some of them directly, but more of them indirectly, and they said, this isn't from Al-Qaeda. It's way more sophisticated than Al-Qaeda could do. And it isn't Iraq either. You got to remember this, Iraq was being blamed for this too. There was what I call the double perpetrator hypothesis, was very strong in October, and that was that the crude letters were written by Al-Qaeda, but the sophisticated anthrax itself came from Iraq, and this justified 2 invasions, therefore. Okay, you got to remember that. Now, the story fell apart because the scientists who had access to this said, first of all, this isn't Al-Qaeda, but secondly, it's not Iraqi either. Even though ABC News was telling us there was bentonite in the anthrax, and that points the finger at Iraq, there is, in fact, no bentonite. In fact, the strain of anthrax, which is called the Ames strain, and the sophisticated way it's weaponized, is characteristic of U.S. anthrax, prepared by our military. And that's when things started to get really hairy. That's before the end of 2001. And so then the FBI had a problem. This seems to come from one of 3 of our own labs serving our military or our intelligence agencies. And they are Fort Detrick, one possibility, Battelle Memorial Institute is the other, and Dugway Proving Ground is the third. It looks like it has to come from one of those 3. And they all serve either, the military or the CIA. So what's the FBI going to do? Well, I'll tell you what they did. They grabbed the lone wolf hypothesis, or even better, the lone nut hypothesis. It's better if you can find an individual who's somewhat mentally unbalanced, because then you can say, well, this is just a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, to quote Shakespeare. In other words, it doesn't mean anything. This guy's a nut. So what? He sent some anthrax, but it doesn't reveal anything systematic about our society or our intelligence agencies or the global war on terror. It's ultimately meaningless. And that's what they did. They chose Bruce Ivins, who was a scientist working with anthrax at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and they said he's mentally unbalanced, which was true to some extent. He was on medications, but he was also a very accomplished scientist, and he also, in my opinion, had nothing to do with the attacks. But they fingered him. They decided he was the perfect lone nut for the job, and then he conveniently died, supposedly by taking an overdose of Tylenol, before he could be indicted and brought to trial. And the FBI then closed the case and said, we found the killer, it's Bruce Ivins, case closed, move on, folks, nothing to see here. So you can see why I don't want to get too dragged down into the Bruce Ivins story. I think it's a distraction. I think it's perfectly clear when you study these attacks carefully, which you can see when you read my book. It's clear that it wasn't done by any lone nut, not Bruce Ivins, not anybody else. It was done by a group. And then you have to say, what group would that be that would have access to highly weaponized anthrax from a highly secure lab serving the military and intelligence communities? And that's where the story gets interesting. And again, I'm a little worried about running out of time here, so if you don't mind, I'm going to say something else. I want to point out that since most of the people who listen to this show are probably people who are interested in 9/11 rather than anthrax, I want to say that one of the things I discovered quite early when I began looking into the anthrax attacks, that there are direct, substantial connections between 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, the kind of connections that we are not generally told about, that the media covered at one time but is now silent about, and that are very important. So, for example, several of the so-called 19 hijackers who supposedly helped pilot planes into the towers and into the Pentagon and so on, are implicated in the anthrax attacks. And nobody had told me that. I didn't know that. I was shocked. But there they are. Their names keep coming up. And so, it becomes clear why the FBI doesn't want to talk about the anthrax attacks. Once you realize that they were an inside job and that they were a false flag operation and that several of the 19 hijackers of 9/11 fame were involved in them, then you can't conclude otherwise than that the 9/11 attacks were also an inside job and a false flag attack. So this discovery of the hijacker connections was quite important, and I'm not saying I was the first one to say anything about it, but I think I was maybe the first one to really draw out the implications, because most of the people who had written books and studies of the anthrax attacks before me, some of them are very detailed, scholarly kind of books, but they all accepted, with possibly one exception, Philip Saracen, but almost all of them accepted the 9/11 story. They accepted the Al-Qaeda story, and so they were baffled at a certain point with the anthrax attacks. They got to a certain point and they couldn't go any further. Whereas, of course, I began this research already knowing that 9/11 was a fraud. So, sorry, I'm glad I got that in, even if it involved running on at the mouth a bit.
No, this is all very important, and it makes me hope that people go out and get your book, because you'll go into more depth there. This is very important, though. There were revelations in the book concerning how much foreknowledge there appeared to be of the impending anthrax attacks before they happened. Some media reports were warning that the next terrorist attack would come in the form of a biological attack. That's pretty spot on. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one way of getting into that is to say, after it became clear to the public that anthrax letters were being sent around, it's not surprising that people became scared and that they began to go out and purchase Cipro, which is or at least was at the time, I don't know if it still is, the antibiotic that was most strongly recommended against anthrax, both to prevent it and also to treat it if you had it in the early stages. So in other words, if we looked at a time graph of, Cipro purchases, we wouldn't be surprised to find that after October 3rd, 2001, which is when anthrax was first diagnosed in a victim, namely Robert Stevens in Florida, that after October 3rd, we would see an increase in purchase. But what struck me was that the fact that the run on Cipro began a couple of weeks before October 3rd. In other words, before anybody was supposed to have known that anthrax was in play. And I thought, well, this is really weird. So then I looked into that, and I saw, yes, there was clearly foreknowledge of the attacks, and there were people who knew they were about to happen. And, some of this is pretty obvious. I mean, Richard Cohen, who was a journalist, said he didn't seem to realize the import of what he was saying. He said, I got a tip from a high government official pretty early after 9/11, so I began taking Cipro before most people had even heard of it. And I'm like, excuse me, Richard? You got a tip? What does that mean? Well, so there was, the New York Times actually reported there was a run on Cipro, that druggists were saying we can't get enough of this stuff. This is before October 3rd, before it became clear that there was anthrax. So then you have to look into that and you say, well, what sent people running the drugstore? What on earth was going on? And you find that people were being prepared for this, that there were leaks into the newspaper and there were talks by high-level members of the executive branch that talked about, we still need to be scared. We can't rest yet. We got to pass this Patriot Act. We got to go to war because we could be subject to a biological attack any time now. And it could be anthrax. Oh, my God. And this was all going on between 9/11. And by the way, on 9/11 itself, George Bush and Dick Cheney, among others, started being put on Cipro. We found that out later. But between 9/11 and the actual revelation that anthrax was in play, during that crucial few weeks, the newspapers were covering all the stuff about, oh my God, Al-Qaeda might be about to attack us with a biological or chemical weapon. And anthrax was mentioned several times very explicitly at that time. And the thing is, anthrax was already in the mail. It was happening, but nobody was supposed to know that yet, because even though there were people getting sick in various newsrooms, nobody had yet diagnosed it as anthrax. So there's a whole chapter in my book on foreknowledge of the attacks, because it's clear that this ultimately derives from criminal foreknowledge. The people who were doing this released this information. And there was a deliberate attempt to cause anxiety and panic in the population. And then, of course, between October 6th and October 8th, there were 2 letters sent out to precisely the 2 members of Senate who were holding up the Patriot Act. Tom Daschle was Senate Majority Leader. He was a Democrat. And Leahy, Senator Leahy, was head of, I think it was the Senate Judicial Committee, which was closely investigating the Patriot Act and slowing it down. These 2 guys were starting to hold up the Patriot Act, and guess what? They both get letters sent out right at the crucial moment with anthrax in them. And of course, the Patriot Act goes through, Congress is appropriately intimidated, and democracy is further weakened in the United States. Imagine this, a group of people sending a weapon of mass destruction to intimidate the people's elected representatives so that they'll pass legislation which reduces the civil rights of Americans, while also propelling wars that will kill huge numbers of people. It's an astonishing story, and that's why I wish people would look more closely at the anthrax attacks.
I was going to ask you about Patrick Leahy and Tom Daschle, and again, they get these letters with anthrax in them at the critical moments, and you can say that they caved as a result of it. Now, this is why I think it's so important to talk about these things, in particular September 11th. I have this dream that there's somebody listening to this show who's following AE 9/11 Truth that may be a member of Congress someday. Maybe they're 15 years old right now, but they're getting this information, and maybe something else will happen in the future. And I'd like to think at a critical moment like this that they would say, wow, they're really going after me now. I need to strengthen my resolve and push forward rather than just caving. And I think lack of knowledge about these kinds of things probably contributed to that. That's how the PSYOP worked. But if you're vigilant against it, if you're guarded from it, then you realize what it's about. It's also interesting, too, the photojournalist that got killed. And yeah, I mean, some people draw some connections with this. I'm just going to mention it for the record. This is the same photojournalist that got pictures of the Bush daughters stumbling over each other drunk. I don't know. It seems kind of strange.
I don't recall seeing any serious effort to explain why Ivins would have targeted Stevens. More likely, the FBI probably said, oh, well, no, Ivins, for a variety of reasons which they can come up with, most of which I consider absurd, was going after the media at this point. He didn't target Stevens specifically. He just sent a letter to the Sun where he happened to work. Maybe it was random, and he got the anthrax and he died. I mean, I'm making this up because I don't remember whether they tried to explain the targeting of that individual. But I mean, you got to remember, anthrax letters went to ABC, went to NBC, went to CBS, among others, and there were people getting anthrax to one degree or another at all those places. So I'm guessing they would say that this is part of his scheme to send it out and intimidate the media who he hated for whatever reason. I mean, if you actually read the FBI's account of why it was Ivans and what their evidence is, I ended up laughing halfway through. At one point they're saying that he sent stuff to New York because he had a thing against New York. I don't remember whether he hated the New York Yankees or something like that. And so he, had this thing about, they just come up with stuff and they try and say, well, he had obsessions about sorority girls. Again, my reaction to that is, well, so what? It may be unfortunate, but the poor guy, what has that got to do with sending anthrax out? And it has very little to do with it. But if you read my book, you'll see why I don't think the Ivans hypothesis even gets off the ground. And there are a lot of people now, even mainstream journalists, who don't believe that. And don't forget, there was an FBI whistleblower who came forward a couple of years ago, Richard Lambert, who said, he was being blackballed by the FBI after he retired. And so he took them to court, and he had been the head of the anthrax investigation at one time. And he said, this is, I don't remember, probably 2016, that the FBI never had a strong case against Ivans and was still sitting on what he called a wealth of exculpatory evidence. In other words, sitting on evidence that shows that it couldn't have been Ivans, and they hadn't shared it yet with the public. So this is an insider saying this, a major insider.
Right, and if it wasn't Ivans, then the fact that he is dead shouldn't make a difference. They should proceed to investigate who was actually behind it. But you have a lack of political will, a lack of bureaucratic will to dig into this, and now your general John Q. Public person will say, oh, that was 18, 19 years ago. It's over. No one's getting sent anthrax right now, so why even bother? And unfortunately, that shows the lack of intellectual curiosity, at the very least, of ordinary people who get their news from Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. I don't care about the superficial political differences. It's all the same to me. That's why I find it hilarious when one of these networks accuses the other network of being the mainstream media. All right, if you're on television and you have billionaires that own your network, you are the mainstream media. If you're here putting on a podcast through a nonprofit organization, then you are not. So you're getting the real truthful stuff, the more pure stuff from corners like AE 9/11 Truth and other sources. Now, we've heard this term, strategy of tension. Please describe to our audience what that is and how these 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, which I consider all the same event, really, how that all fits into the strategy of tension.
Yeah, I think, by the way, just before I get to strategy of tension, that it's up to us in the 9/11 Truth Movement to make a point of not letting the anthrax attacks be forgotten. So when we give talks or whatever, we can say there was a two-part attack that took place in the fall of 2001. A two-part attack, airplanes and anthrax. And they were clearly connected, and that's been shown. I think we should say that. Now, as far as the strategy of tension goes, I didn't make it a big part of my book, but I did think I should mention it. The term is often used for the strategy that was used in Operation Gladio after Second World War in Europe, whereby, this is a long story. I don't know how to summarize it. But basically, the strategy is to cause tension in the minds and hearts of the population. In other words, anxiety and panic, just like with the anthrax attacks, in order to encourage them to submit to a more authoritarian government. And that was done in Operation Gladio in Europe, blowing people up, setting off bombs at railway stations and so on. It was all blamed on left-wing groups, communists and so on, whereas in fact it was done often by state operatives working with extreme right-wing groups. And so, yeah, that's the strategy of tension. And And it seems to me quite clear that it's continuing to be used, and that this two-part operation in the fall of 2001 involved the strategy of tension being unleashed on the population of the United States.
Absolutely, and I can remember it. I grew up, I was somebody that never really feared anything happening, particularly to me. I made fun of all my friends who thought all the computers were going to fail in the year 2000. Proceeded that way, and then it was actually after the Anthrax attacks that I started thinking, oh my God, some serious stuff can go down here. So it worked on me for that short period of time, and if it worked on me, it meant that it was working on everybody else. That's why I consider it to be a continuation. I kind of look at 9/11 itself as a story, beginning with the attack itself. Obviously, a little bit before that, when you get to know the stuff that we know, and then going on into as far as even the bin Laden killing, or supposed, we can maybe cover that on another episode someday. But, it's a big, long story, and this is all just a continuation of it. Even though we focus on the controlled demolition evidence at 9/11 Truth as an organization, because it's the smart way to go about it. It's the strongest evidence that the politicians and even the scientists on the other side really can't argue with. I encourage just the average person to look into everything that you can. Even go to official sources, because how can you fight something if you don't know what you're fighting against? Take the time to read the 9/11 Commission report. If you don't have time to read, or you're one of these people that falls asleep when they read, which seems to be a lot of people that I know, you can get the audio version from different sources and listen to it while you're working in your garden or whatever, but learn exactly what they're saying happened, and then learn exactly why it's not true. And then you get a very good picture of how our government operates. Graeme, in our last couple minutes here, I want people to read your book. Tell them how they can get it.
Well, they can easily find it by Googling my name and the title. So it'd be Graeme MacQueen and the 2001 Anthrax Deception. They can get it through Amazon, and they can also go on the website of the publisher, Clarity Press, and buy it directly from them. So either one of those will work. It's soft cover. It's not a huge book. I'm told it's a fairly straightforward, clear read, not a tome. And I think it'll be worth people's while.
Exactly, and we'll get a link to that and put it in the body of the show description at 911freefall.com so that people can get quicker access to it and add it to their library. Graeme, this has been very informative. I know we didn't dive into the full meat of the book, but that's not what we want to do, because we want people to read the book. We just want to give them a taste here. But thank you so much for coming on here and for all your work you've been doing over these years. You've been a staunch voice out there that we can always rely on to rise to the occasion and contribute whenever you can. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming on 9/11 Free Fall today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you for having me, Andy, and this is a very important show, so all the best in the future.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific, and every other Sunday night on BBS Radio at 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.